Here's a couple boards that I've shown before. They have a little cup to them. I've clamped them together so that the joint is right on the money. I tighten one end, tighten the other, clamped it up, and you'll see it is not flat. Now this might work for a small, say, end tabletop, where I can secure it down to the table base. But if it's warped and twisted bad enough, it actually could twist the frame of the table. And if I'm gluing up several boards, I'm going to have joints come together, and it's going to be very difficult to align all the joints at every location along the panel for those joints to come out properly. I'll have to end up belt sanding, and it'll take a ton of work. We're going to go through a process here where doing things step by step, we're going to result in panels that glue up very easily and lay very flat. You also notice I haven't really worried about the width of my boards. As long as they're wider than the 16 inches I'm after, I've just allowed for the extra material of how wide these boards are. I could almost not quite get it out of 2 boards, so I needed a third. I will start removing material from each edge and flattening these boards. Now, these boards are almost 8 inches wide, and they are not going to go through my 6-inch joiner. So the first thing I need to do is take the material and make it so that everything's safe to use on the joiner. So we'll go to the table saw first. I've set my table saw fence to about 5.5 inches. 5.5, 5 3/4 is about all I can really expect to get across a 6-inch joiner. There'll be an irregular surface, so if there's a little bow to the board, I'm not going to be able to gain full 6 inches. So I've set it. I'll rip and be very careful about how I orientate every board as I'm doing this, so everything gets put back right where it came from. I've rearranged all the boards here on my bench back to their original position, and now all my boards have a relatively straight edge, but not good enough to glue together. So I'm going to go to the joiner. I'm going to flatten the bottom face and square up one edge, so it'll be flat and square, each one of these boards. I'll only do the bottom and the table sawn edge. Before I do any machining, I want to make sure I understand how to run material across here safely and take advantage of the material so that I'm not fighting it. Okay, first thing is the way this board is oriented, the grain is actually running down towards the bottom and back, so that when the teeth are coming around, they're pulling with the grain. So the first thing I want to do is flatten it with the grain running towards the ground where my feet are standing. I'm going to use 2 push sticks. I try not to close my hands through and grip. I want to make sure my hands are open, because if something slips, I can let go. I'm looking to make sure I've gotten everything flat. It's going to take one more pass. With the bottom cleaned up, now I need to take and square up one edge. Now remember, I've got to take that flat surface and take advantage of the square fence. But also need to pay attention to the grain direction up here. This is pretty parallel, so it's safe to run. This could run across either way, but again, I got to make sure I'm up against the fence. But I want, again, the same thing. The grain direction would be going towards the floor where I'm standing if I've got some grain issues. Otherwise, I'll get some bad tear out. And that'll leave me a square edge. You'll notice that when I push the material across, I got my hand away from the area above the knives and then came back, and really I'm applying pressure to keep this edge of the board true to the fence. And really, it's all a matter of keeping everything in contact right past the blade. That's the most critical part of the joiner. So this board is faced on the bottom and jointed on the edge, and it would be ready to go to the planer. So let's get our other stock all prepared. I'm always looking to see how much of the surface is flat. I don't have to have it perfectly flat. If there's a couple small spaces, I can still go to the planer. I want to take advantage of the full thickness of that material. So if I totally flatten this, by the time I flatten this edge, the top surface, and then come back to clean up this, I'll maximize material. But if I take everything finally off here, everything over here, I may actually end up with a thinner board. Now that we have all the bottoms flat and one edge true, I'm going to go to the planer. That will make the top surface parallel to that perfectly flat bottom. Much like the joiner, I need to watch my grain orientation. The blades are spinning around like this. What I don't want is my grain pointing up because it will lift and cause tear out. What I want is the grain to be running like this, so as it lifts the material, it's lifting with the grain. So I need to flip this board around so the grain is moving up, and so will the knives, and it will keep from getting tear out. I'll set the blade to take off about a 32nd of an inch. I made the tops parallel to the bottom, and I've cleaned up any leftover skip marks from the joiner. So now all my material is parallel top and bottom and true on one edge. Now I just want to go through and just make sure that I have everything back in its proper orientation. Now I want to clean up and start thinking about that other edge. I also need to think about my clamp up strategy to make sure that I can put things through my 13-inch planer or whatever planer width you have. I can't glue this all up in one shot and run it through the planer. I've left the material thicker than my final dimension. In fact, this material, I'm just 1/32 shy of 7/8 of an inch. So looking at what I have left, I have 12 inches with these 3 boards and 7.5 over here. So that'll run through the planer and that will run through the planer. So I'm going to glue these 2 up and this. But first, like I said, I need to make sure everything is straight and parallel. I've got all my boards flat, cut at 90 degrees on one edge, and cut 90 degrees on the other edge. Everything's ready to glue up. Now there's one final check I want to make. I've got a knot over here, and I've got some light wood here. This is actually sapwood. It's right near the bark of the tree, and color-wise, it's not going to look very good. I want to look to make sure I've got even color and grain orientation going across. And actually, what's really nice is I haven't worried about how wide, I've got a 5-inch, 5-inch, and 5-inch wide board to get uniform. What I've done is I've created grain patterns that run across the joint line so that the width of the boards really aren't evident. But I've got this sap, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this board end for end. I don't like that. I don't like that. That's not bad. The discoloration goes away. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to rip a little bit off this board. I've cut that sapwood out, and that grain runs pretty good. So I'll need to remember that and make an adjustment on my next panel so that I get the grain wrap. The other thing I can do is flip this over, but I think I'm just fine where it was. Now for this knot, as long as I've got 16 inches, which is what I'm really after, I'm okay with this knot. I'll include it because I'll want to clean up any edging and true up any spots. If I had a gap in a board, I may need to go back to the joiner, depending on the quality of my rip blade. They say that some blades are joint quality. That can be true, but I still like to run the boards across that sawn edge across the joiner to make sure they're perfectly square and perfectly flat. I've set up my clamps so that I'm about 8 to 10 inches apart, and I've also set them slightly wider than the panel that I'm going to glue up. So I'll transfer my boards over one at a time, keeping them in their proper orientation, and we'll apply some glue. We'll let the glue dry for 3 or 4 hours. We'll get this other set clamped up, and when they're both ready to go, we'll run them through the planer. Now you might be tempted to go ahead and remove the glue, but if I use a wet rag to remove this, it's going to dilute the glue and put it into the grain structure and may cause difficulty in staining later. So I don't want to do that. What I want to do is I want to let it sit for maybe 45 minutes. The glue will get rigid enough that I'll just be able to scrape it off, and I can use a card scraper. I can actually use a credit card just to shear it off. So here we are, our panel's back in its original orientation. And what I need to do now is I'm going to run both these two separate panels through the surface planer to the final dimension I'm after. Now, the real reason that I want to do this is if I would have glued this all up in one time, I would have had 1, 2, 3, 4 different glue joints that I had to all deal with and worry about sanding smooth. What this is going to do is allow these 2 glue joints and this glue joint over here to totally be taken out of the picture. The planer will do the work for us, and all I have to focus on is getting one glue joint to look good in that 3/4 dimension. And then I should be able to just, with a random orbit sander, clean this panel up, and it should be complete. So I'll go to the planer, and we'll plane it down to our final thickness. So we've completed gluing up our panel, we've removed any glue, and we're ready to finalize the dimensions of the part. What I want to do is eliminate any defects, or maybe the fact that this piece is the least appealing of the pieces that are glued up. I really like this part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this off first. So I'll measure the width to maximize what I can get, and I'll set my saw. If my cut has removed all of the knot, which it has, I can now trim the panel to its final width. To cut the part to its length, I'll use a crosscut sled. It's just made from some 1/2-inch plywood, a runner, and a backer block. I'm going to cut the marked end first, and you'll see why. Now, I can put some tape across the project. And mark it just like it came off. With that removed, I can trim the panel to length by flipping it over. What I want to make sure is, since I use this as my reference edge on the cutoff sled, I always want to just flip it over to make sure that my angles are consistent from one side to the end. I know that I've ripped it parallel, but it's just a good practice. And now we've got a great looking panel that we can incorporate into our project.